Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're, of course, going to have another incredible and informative episode for you guys today. And this may even be a very controversial episode we have today. I had some other ideas to talk about before yesterday that I was going to discuss, but, there was an eruption on Twitter that, forced me to address a certain issue or something that I see a lot in the debates that's been going on in our sphere over time, and it is over the question of saying the regime or the empire is the Globalist American Empire. Why we use this word instead of other terms? And there's always been these people throughout. I've been seeing most of this topic ever since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, is that a lot of people began using Globalist American Empire, GAE, GAE, rather than other terms, and then people would just get mad and demand you use another term that was more based. Their preferred term is ZOG, Zionist Occupied Government, or Zionist Occupation Government. We'll get into the moment of the origins of that and why I don't use it and why I prefer GAE, as I believe it's more accurate. So people have always gotten mad about this term because they think it's cucked or inaccurate or what have you. But as I argued in a tweet, GAE embodies what we're up against, because one of the hard facts of this is that regardless of what you think of who the people are or where their origins, or even if you want to just say these are not Americans, is that American institutions with American figures, with American political leaders that we've elected are responsible for the regime and what we're doing throughout the world. And we can see that in Ukraine, where America is setting the policy there, not Europe, not Israel, not any other country. We're the ones setting it, and it's directed by people in the United States who are American leaders, American institutions. And when we even see what's going on domestically, a lot of this is based on you could say it's a twisted version of values and ideologies that extend back even to the colonial era and certainly to the founding. I'm not one of those people who believe that the American founding was rotten at the core. It was immediately cucked. It was immediately libtarded, that we have to go back to base reactionaryism or something of that sort. I've never been one of those people. But there is something there that we've seen grow over time that has developed into what we have today. And generally what the appeals that people who are in our elites and liberals do, or the appeals they make, are generally to these ideas and values that can be extended even back to the colonial era of this radical egalitarianism, this hyper-individualism, and throwing off your roots and your past and your obligations and your traditions and any type of duties you may have to embrace a consumer identity, and everyone is equal, all men are created equal. This fetishization of democracy that we see, and all these types of things that is spread within this ideology that some people, that without a better term for it, is Americanism, even though it's different from the Americanism of the pre-World War II era, the Americanism of the post-World War II era, which I think it would be a better term to say it's US-ianism, using the term that our friend Nemitz uses, US-ian, instead of American. It does refer to this hyper-ideological concept of America that extends back to the roots of America, even though most of the founders would have objected to the radical application of it. And when we see our institutions and the people in charge, yes, they are still American. What they appeal to get their ideological objectives is seen as American by the rest of the world, and even Americans identify that as true Americanism. And today is what you'd seen, the type of corny patriotism of the George W. Bush era, and even the type of multicultural patriotism that Bill Clinton and Barack Obama tried to foster. These things can be found in America's past. And I try to trace that heritage in our past and try to identify that and counteract that as my goal. And when we refer to our foreign policy, it is American directed and it is done by American institutions. So I think you could say that American is not the best word, because it is means something different than what America would have meant prior to World War II, which is an ethnic conception of America or a folkish conception of America. The American that is referred to in Globalist American Empire is not that. It's the ideological conception of America that believes that we are defined by our values and supposedly just our pursuit of making money and and how we just want to live our lives whatever the way we want, and this hyper individualism and radical egalitarianism and those types of things. That's what the American means in the title. It would be better to say USEN, Globalist USEN Empire, but that most people have not caught on to USEN, and it's an awkward term. And for most people, they still identify American with that ideological concept, which is unfortunate, but that's something that we would hopefully change in the future. So I understand that regard, because American and Globalist American Empire does not mean that ethnic conception of America or the founding stock of America, the historic American nation. It means something else. It means that ideological conception of America. But for a lack of a better term, that's unfortunately what we use. So that's why I use GAE. And now going on to the question of ZOG, which everyone is demanding that I use, or is the new term, or some people want to demand that. One thing is that I've seen the recent popularity of people insisting on it is that, one, even when people insist on it, they don't use it as much. They typically use like another euphemism like regime, system, empire, those type of terms. And even prior to Darren Beatty coming up with GAE, they were using other terms to describe the new America. They would have either said the Qua, Vi-America, stuff like that, even going back to the old alt-right. People would use ZOG occasionally, but a main reason that people didn't want to use ZOG, even going back to the old alt-right, is that they felt it was something associated with white nationalism 1.0, which it was, because ZOG originates from the Turner Diaries written by William Luther Pierce, which is maybe not the thing you want to associate yourself so much with if you're trying to do, make it your way in politics. I mean, Turner Diaries advocates for racial extermination, terrorism, nuclear war, a bunch of things that I don't know if you want to share with your grandma, these ideas that you're about. And people have wanted to move away and associate because they know that this was bad optics. People understood they're trying to reach a larger audience outside of the traditional WN ghetto or whatever, and they realized that they had to use different terminology, even if they thought that it was still a decent term or what have you. And even with ZOG compared to GAE, I think one reason that it still has some popularity is it sounds very sinister and evil. It's like a villain, like Zog, and even there's the Zod, the villain from Superman. Like when you say Zog, that evokes a very menacing tone, and it's much... And if you're trying to describe something as like this villainous evil that it's ruling over you or as a tyrant, it has a little bit more bite than GAE, even though it's not as quite as accurate. And going over into what it means, if we go break by point, I mean, the key word in this is obviously Zionist. Now, what does Zionist mean? It means avid supporter of Israel, or, Israeli nationalist. It's fundamentally connected to Israel. Now, Israel does not control our foreign policy at this moment. Now, at times, it's strongly influenced our foreign policy, and especially at the George W. Bush era. I think at that time, if you're talking about a Zionist-occupied government, the George W. Bush cabinet was, that was a fair epithet to use at that time in how they were deploying our foreign policy, because we were going, at that time, the Globalist American Empire's interests and Israel's interests were at their most aligned. And what we did in Iraq, what we did in, trying to move into Syria, even under Obama, a lot of these things were to the benefit of Israel, even though the Globalist American Empire also had its own interests into these conflicts that were independent, but these interests aligned and they had similar goals. Ever since Obama, it has not been quite the case. And even before, Bush, really, for most of the time of the Globalist American Empire has been under the Cold War. And the Cold War's primary foreign policy interest was not Israel. It was not close to it at all one of the primary interests. Our primary interest was countering the Soviet Union and communism. If you look at these wars, Korea, Vietnam, support for the Afghans against the Soviets, even, the huge NATO commitment we had in Europe, and anything else you look at, any of these coups we were doing in Latin America, pretty much everything was designed around the Cold War and countering Soviet influence, countering communist influence, and at times even countering Chinese influence. That was our primary foreign policy goal. It was not about securing Israel's interests. Now, from JFK onward, when it came to the Middle East, we overwhelmingly favored Israel when it came to that area of conflict and region. Much more so than the Arabs, and you see, and that developed more and more over time to the point where, and you really stuck home that there was no way that America could criticize Israel due to the incredible influence of the Israeli lobby as outlined in mainstream academia and scholarship, that I don't think anyone can dispute that. There was one time that George H.W. Bush had some mild criticism of Israel and their policy with the Palestinians, and he had to walk back those comments. I think that was done in sometime in the early 90s. And ever since then, it's been, there's no question of what side we take in the Middle East. And then in the 2000s, our primary foreign policy becomes the Middle East, and generally what we were doing in the Middle East was supported by Israel and fully aligned with their interests, and thus that gave the impression that our whole foreign policy is directed by them, which with some of these neoconservatives, that was a fair assessment to make. But that began to change, oddly enough, under Barack Obama, where Barack Obama really did try to pivot hard out of the Middle East. I mean, we got out of Iraq. He at times wanted us to get out of Afghanistan toward the later terms, but he didn't really want to get out of it. He wanted to move more to Asia and countering Russia rather than worrying about the Middle East. And even the real decline of it still has more tremendous influence than probably any other country in American foreign policy, but American foreign policy works to its own beat, not to that of Israel. And you can really see that when Barack Obama negotiated the Iran deal, which the Israelis were fully opposed to. Neoconservatives were apoplectic about this, yet he still did this, and this is a part of his plan to pivot out of the Middle East and not be, showing that the GAE's interests are no longer fully aligned with Israel's interests. And that kept developing, that there was showing that this president who is willing to go against Israel. Now, when Trump got into office, fully aligned with Israel's interests, even though we didn't go into Syria, we didn't go into Iran, which a lot of the Israeli interests wanted us to do, or we didn't take out Assad rather in Syria. But even with Obama, another thing that he opposed Israel on is going into Syria. They pushed for it hard. They really pushed for it hard. And there were, gay interests independent of Israel that also wanted to go into Syria, but Obama refused and did not bring us into taking out Assad in 2012 or 2013. I mean, we did have a limited engagement in there against ISIS, but really what they wanted us to do is to go in there to do regime change against Assad, which Obama didn't do, and neither did Trump do, which was against Israel's interests. But with Trump and him associating himself with Israel support and Zionism, the left began to move towards a more anti-Zionist direction, even though the mainstream of the Democratic Party is Israeli supporters. They're more moderate than Republicans on this issue, while there's now greater space for people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib to be anti-Zionist in the party. There are no anti-Zionists in the Republican Party, or at least among their elected officials. Even someone like Rand Paul, who's made criticism of Israel in the past, had a wailing wall photo op. I think Thomas Massie may be the closest one to that, but even compared to someone like Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib, he would be claimed an Israel supporter. So there's not that much room in Israel. So one of the things that you've seen develop, mostly, I would say going back to Obama and accelerated under Trump, is that the parties have changed their stances on Israel, is that Democrats are not as pro-Israel as they were before. And even this is reflected in someone like, I was about to call him Barack Obama, but Joe Biden, who in the past has been a fervent Israeli supporter, but even when Israel went into, bombing Palestine again over some conflict in the summer of 2021, he clamped down on them and told them to stop and to move back from that option, which in the past you wouldn't have seen many Democratic presidents do. Even Barack Obama, when Israel did something similar in 2014, he was more hesitant to, really push Israel to retreat from that option. So even among the mainstream, they're not as fervently pro-Israel anymore, but that's reflected in the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, in the Republican Party, even though the right has talked more about Israeli criticism, and for rightfully so, many of the wrong things that effects Israel has had on our foreign policy are stealing state secrets and intelligence, illegal intelligence sharing, and things like Jonathan Pollard. The Republican Party has become still about as pro-Israel as it was before Trump. You don't even have like a Ron Paul figure anymore in the party. As I said, you really just have Thomas Massie, maybe Rand Paul to a much lesser extent, but that's it. And this is reflected among both parties' rank and file. Among Republicans, 78% prefer Israelis to Palestinians. There's only like 30% or so. Among Democrats, those figures are 44% to 12%. Now, that may say they still overwhelmingly favor Palestinians, but when asked to express favorable attitudes towards both groups, it's roughly the same. I believe it's 64% for Israelis, 62% for Palestinians, and this is among Democrats. There is very little favorability towards Palestinians are not as much favorability towards Palestinians among Republicans as it is with Democrats. And even when it comes to the question of protecting Israel is very important to America, only 22% of Democrats say that it's important. Meanwhile, 61% of Republicans think so. So this is a major change over time, which, and this poll was taken in 2021, and I think those numbers have only increased that partisan gap over time, because one thing is that the Democratic coalition is now primarily made up of POC, and they don't give a shit about Israel at all, and they view Israel as just another white supremacist settler state in the same way that their parents and grandparents would have viewed South Africa. And that view is increasingly reflected in liberal media and in the Squad. The way the media covers Israel is very different than it was, when I was growing up in high school, which was 100% supportive, I can't believe the Palestinians are mad. Now there's a much more sympathetic angle to Palestinians. And this just goes, long-winded discussion on the question of Israel, but it goes to show that Israel is not in control of foreign policy. And you can even see this when it comes to Ukraine. A lot of these people are very mad about my take. We're also celebrating the multipolarity, which would sort of include Israel on the side of Russia, because, they have been a much more neutral party in this conflict. They've really wanted peace in there. They have not, they've resisted weapons shipments to Ukraine. And even one thing with America's wholly dependent on Ukraine or Israel for their foreign policy, it was announced, I think, last week that they're taking, a lot of their arms surplus. They're no longer giving that to Israel. They're giving it to Ukraine, which obviously is a slap in the face of Israel. So they're not, they're even doing stuff to Israel now that would have been maybe unthinkable under the George W. Bush administration, but they're now doing it and it really goes to show that they're not in control of the foreign policy, which is what Zionist occupied government would mean if it's all directed towards Israelis' interests. But as we can see from our foreign policy, it's not, because Israel's interests or what they want in Ukraine is completely different from what America wants. America wants the war to go on for however long as it wants, because they want a weak Russia. They want an isolated Russia. They don't give a shit about Ukraine. Ukraine's just a tool to achieve this. And they feel that the war is helping to weaken and isolate Russia. Meanwhile, Israel wants to do business with Russia. It would prefer a Russia that is much better to do business with, which a weak and isolated Russia can achieve that. So, and if, you're thinking that Zog or Russia is against Zog, Russia is very pro-Israel. You could arguably say that Russia is maybe even more pro-Israel than America at this moment. So it'd be hard to say Russia is against Zog when they're at least equally pro-Israel to America. So when it comes to foreign policy, GAE's interests are independent of Israel's interests. The State Department and CIA don't seem to be that thrilled with Israel. The State Department has always been very, will want like condemnations of some of Israel's behavior, and they've operated now much more differently from Israel. So America's not acting, when it acts foreign policy, except for the George W. Bush era, it's acted on its own interests and for different interests than that of Israel, even though at times it's aligned. And when we've approached the Middle East, it's usually been with an overwhelming bias towards Israel for the last at least 60 years. But the Middle East was only the center of our focus from from Bush to Obama, and it's no longer the center of our focus when it comes to foreign policy. And so we're being restored to a traditional American foreign policy position, at least, well, not maybe traditional, but at least since the Cold War, of seeing Russia and China as our main geopolitical threats and not giving a shit, or not caring as much about the Middle East as we did under Bush. Now then, people, when you make those arguments, will say, well, when we mean Zionist, we don't necessarily mean Israeli. We actually would like to say jog instead of zog. We would actually emphasize Jewish rather than Zionist, but we feel that Zionist, is more optical, so we'll go with that. So it's a funny argument that they're saying that you have to say zog when they admit that it's also an optics term, which it's not really that optical, and it's also more inaccurate than gay. But then they just say it probably because just zog is, as it says, rolls off the tongue, has a certain bite to it, creates this menace of what you're describing more so than other terms. So they'll revert back to this optics and say, well, what we mean is Jewish, not Zionist. Now, I know where this is coming from, that ever since, the early 20th century, especially in culture, especially going even back to the 1900s, 1910s, like Jewish have a disproportionate influence over American culture. And even in the 1930s, they've had a disproportionate influence over our political institutions. That's just undeniable. I mean, compared to their population, it's been, 2 to 3% for most of that time. And yet you'll see people like 24% of the people in charge of these positions are in some places like Hollywood. It's a majority of positions. And that is, a small minority with disproportionate influence, and they feel no connection back to the founding. A lot of these people don't, and they're very opposed to an ethnic conception of America because they feel they'll be left out, and they much prefer an ideological conception of America and a multicultural, diverse America where anyone can just embrace these values and come here and say that. Now, that's what a lot of this comes from, but it's one, I think making that it implies that it's an exclusively Jewish thing, which it's not. It's disproportionately influenced Jewish. I would even say it's probably not even majority Jewish influence, especially now. And I would even note that even though people always want to call cuck, is like, even talking about this stuff and get you censored and stuff, maybe YouTube will ban this conversation. I don't think they will, but if they do, this is what happens, is that people don't, a big reason that a lot of people don't talk about this, or it's hard to talk about, is that if you want to give the most unpopular position on this is a nuanced position. Everyone hates nuance on this because it's much better to go with simplistic and more exciting explanations. And people are still going to get mad and call you a bigot for an anti-Semite for even discussing that, or even mentioning that, yes, they've had disproportionate influence over American culture and had disproportionate powerful roles in American political institutions. Even saying that, they're like, what? No, you can't say that. Even though if you read any history, you can see that for your own eyes. And even going into an issue like immigration in the 1965 Immigration Act, besides the Kennedys, the Kennedy family, pretty much all the people who were really involved in that were not, found on the Mayflower, to put it one way. But it was also them allying with other Ellis Islanders into doing this. And many of these Ellis Islanders really did not like the restrictive Anglo-Protestant America. They did not like this idea that you had to have had cultural similarities or have that bloodlines back to the founding and the colonial era. They felt that a true American is one who believes in the radical egalitarianism and hyper-individualism as promised in the ideological conception of America. And so they began pushing for this. And there was also many WASPs who were also fully in agreement with them and helping them along. One example is Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was a famous Supreme Court justice, considered one of the great Supreme Court justices, or most famous Supreme Court justices, who shared many of the ideological conceptions of these Ellis Islanders, who were then gaining control in America, or gaining much more influence in America. And even when America was not, especially when it came to foreign policy, did not have the best relationship with Israel in the 1950s. Eisenhower cracked down on Israel a lot, really told them to fuck off at times. I mean, even when Israel, Britain, and France invaded the Suez Canal and had the Suez Canal crisis against Egypt, Eisenhower came down hard on all three parties and told them to stop. And, that's something that future presidents probably wouldn't have done, but Eisenhower did it. Even at that time, Jewish Americans were, or Jews in America were wielding disproportionate influence over our institutions. And I think at the peak of this, where you could have said Zog, which both a cultural and foreign policy alignment probably happened in the 90s and 2000s. And this is at the time that random places in America were building, Holocaust museums and statues, which is like, why is this in Arkansas? Like, we weren't responsible for this. Why is this here? But all these things were being built up anyway, and Holocaust education, all these things were, going into the education system. But that's being knocked off to a bit because of who people are entering in the elite. Much more of the new elite now don't care about these atrocity stories, and they feel that it gives the old Ellis Islanders too much sway over society. And also, in the same way that Ellis Islanders, moved into the elite and changed the America of the pre-World War II era, and they fundamentally changed that, the immigrants of the post-65 era, the ones who benefited from the 1965 Immigration Act and the 1990 Immigration Act, are now coming and wanting to shape America in their own direction. And they want America's chief things that the average American to feel most guilty for is not the Holocaust. They want to feel them the most guilty for slavery and colonialism. They'll still bring up the Holocaust and warn is this is what happens when you allow Donald Trump to be president. They'll still appeal to that, but when it talks about the great historical crimes, and this is emphasized by the 1619 Project and a lot of other historical works that are coming out, it's that how wrong America was for slavery, and even this reparations debate that is going on, it is basically arguing that no one has suffered more than blacks in America, and that's why they're deserving of, each one of them is deserving of $1 million. And also these post-65 immigrants and also blacks don't see Jews as a part of their minority coalition. Many Jews still see themselves as a minority, as distinct from whites. The BIPOC do not see them as distinct from whites. They just see them as privileged whites, and thus they are more willing to criticize Israel as a white supremacist state, or see Israel as a white supremacist state, and also see Jews as just other privileged whites that are hoarding too much power and wealth. And these types advocate for an even more radical left-wing version of an ideological conception of America, because they're still appealing to the values and some of these ideas that were found in some of our founding documents. They just take it to an even more extreme degree. As the 1619 Project argues, they say that the people who wrote these documents were white supremacists, but they still wrote good things. But the only way that these values were realized was due to blacks and non-whites. Whites are the villains of American history. Blacks and non-whites are the heroes. And the old civic nationalists, disproportionately Jewish influenced Americanism of the Cold War era and in the even post-Cold War era was much more colorblind. It said that anyone could be an American, and it just imagined that all the founding fathers were radical egalitarians, racial egalitarians who wanted a multicultural, diverse America and just wanted people to live up to their values. While the new 1619 Project left that is starting to influence the new elite of America wants to see those guys as white supremacists and the true founders of our country as the Indians, blacks, and other non-whites, and whites are just simply the villains of the story unless they're helping out non-whites. And you can see this inner elite conflict in some of the arguments over cancel culture. A big reason that cancel culture and this arguments over wokeness are so prevalent is because there are elements of the old elite who are very much worried about the new elite and getting pushed out. And the new standards is realizing that that's a direct threat to their power. And if you ever look at stuff like the intellectual dark web, or even some of these moderate liberals who complain about wokeness and say it's gone too far, you'll see a disproportionate Jewish character there among a lot of those people who are signing these letters and being involved in that. And I think that is a reflection of their feeling that the new elite is hostile towards them, and the new ideology is not going to put them at the top anymore. And even when it comes to the question of Zionism, is that in the 80s and 90s, and even through most of the post-Cold War era, or Cold War era, mostly even the liberal Jews were Zionists, or at least moderate supporters of Israel. Today, that's not the case. I mean, most of the younger millennial, Gen Z Jews, and even a lot of the Gen X Jews who are now in positions of authority and influence, they don't have that, respectful attitudes toward Israel. At most, they don't care about it, or at worst, they view that as or I wouldn't even say at worst, but just at another point, they would say they see it as a white settler state that has to change in the same way that apartheid South Africa had to change. They're secular liberal Jews. They're not even, they don't practice religion at all. Their identity is mainly based on feeling that they are either a victimized minority, but at the same time, they now have more sympathy for Palestinians than they do with Israelis. And Donald Trump pointed this out too when he's like talking about it's like white evangelicals, they love Israel more than Jews. And when it comes to liberal Jews, that is true. That is true, is that white evangelicals are like the strongest Zionist demographic in America now, much more than the liberal Jewish demographic. Now, some liberal Jewish organizations could be called Zionists, like the ADL. They're still fervent Israeli supporters, and they get very mad about any Israel criticism, like college students protesting. They immediately go to anti-Semitism. But even that view is often criticized by the left. I mean, ADL still wields a lot of influence, but they do take a lot more heat from both the right and the left now than they ever did in my lifetime or any time in American history, is that both sides criticize them. The left criticizes them for being too fervently Zionist and being mean to non-whites who are just expressing free speech, while the right views them as a partisan organization that just attacks Republicans and attacks their issues and doesn't emphasize being pro-Israel enough, and that should be their main interest. So you still have groups like that, but they are being put in a weaker position than before and facing more criticism. And I think over time, in 20 years, a lot of these new immigrants who really don't like these people bossing around are just going to tell them to fuck off and want greater focus on their own interests and their own prejudices. And that's one thing to say, is that one of the thing about the current elite is that it's competing minority groups all within this, and they're all appealing to this bizarre or reading of this ideological conception of America is to advocate for their own interests, even though a lot of their own interests are much more clannish, and they're definitely seeing, ethnicity and other things that they say that nobody in America does. We just see merit, but they're appealing to this framework that is guaranteed by the globalist American empire to further their own interests and further their own power. And now we have multiple competing minority groups, Indians, Pakistanis, Armenians, Chinese, Koreans, all these different groups of people are competing within the framework of America. And even like some of these white Hispanics who are trying to claim, Hispanic ancestry, and that are claiming that they're non-white and people of color, and they're like have blonde hair, blue eyes. Like all these people are competing in the victimization of Olympics, and that's pushing the old Ellis Islanders aside. So going back, it's been a long discussion on this. The reason why I use the Globalist American Empire is that it accurately describes what we're in. Yes, even if you want to see, some, non-true Americans operating this, still American institutions, and it still has the support of a large number of Americans. The one thing, unfortunate thing I want to say about this is why I use GAE is that, unfortunately, a lot of this is our fault. A lot of this is us believing stupid ideas and being too open with the world and believing that anyone can be an American, is that white Americans are the true believers in this stuff. Other groups, sometimes they are authentic believers in this. Some of the, people, Ellis Islanders and the Jews who were involved in this stuff in the mid 20th century were genuine believers in this, even though they still had their own ethnic interests. Today, I don't think any of these people are genuine believers in this Americanism that is articulated in the Cold War era. But except for white Americans, they truly believe this. They're like, well, as long as you're a hard worker, I don't see race. What is race? What's color? Is that I just care about your commitment to values and ideas. Is that white Americans are like the least racist, least anti-Semitic, least racial exclusionary people on earth. And a lot of this has led to our present plight. A lot of this allows other groups to exploit our generosity and our benefits to move us into a negative direction. And a lot of these things that happen negatively are unfortunately supported by us and us believing in idiotic ideas. And this is not as, it's a more uncomfortable fact. It's a less popular fact. It's easier to see a hostile force as like the main instigator of this. But unfortunately, a lot of this stuff originates from us, or even when we had other people in charge, or a disproportionate number of these people in charge, we allowed that to happen. A lot of these WASPs were like, oh, come on in. This is awesome. We're truly showing what America's about. and they got to change America. And then the foundational Americans were still like, whoa, this is awesome. This is what America was all about. This is what Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton wanted. And with all that said, we really have to work on convincing our people to think differently, to accept different ideas. And where they're at right now, they are very worried about bad optics, we'll say. And if you go up to them and like talking about Zog and all these things, they'll be like, what is that? And then if you they don't know what Zionist means. And then if you have to explain it, and they're like, well, I don't mean Israel controls, I mean Jews. And they'll be like, what? And they'll be totally confused about this. Optics still matter. We still have to use terms and words that are going to appeal to at least conservative Americans who are like Tucker Carlson watchers and are Trump supporters, or even Ron DeSantis supporters, are people who are open to this ideas that they fear what's happening with immigration. They don't like what's happening with anti-white racism in the schools. They're upset by Drag Queen Story Hour, all these things. They're open to our message. You just have to tailor it to them and try not to score points with your own crowd, with the chorus that's already behind you with some of these ideas. That's the main purpose. And I think some people want to focus more on the crowd that's already with us rather than trying to appeal to others. And sometimes people accuse me of that. I mean, some ideas I promote are not going to be what a political campaign is on, but I'm not a politician. I'm a political commentator. I'm a podcaster and Substack writer. So you're given more leeway to address certain issues. But that's also what it comes to being truthful and accurate. And I still think Globalist American Empire is the most accurate term that we have. Zog is not accurate, as I've said, and even then you want to say, well, it's a euphemism for and good optics version of what we want to say, then it's like, well, might as well just use Globalist American Empire, which is even more optical and more accurate and captures the point of view that we're trying to express, just as any other term. And this is a long discussion over, arguments over which acronym we should use. If people want to use whatever terms they want, that's fine. But I'm just saying that this is a defense of my terms that I'm using. I don't think of course, this segment is going to piss off probably everyone, but it's what I'm sticking with and it's what I'm saying. And I'm going to keep saying gay. I think it's still an effective term. I think the only problem with it is that you would want to separate it from what is the historic American nation, which by using American, you do have that unfortunate effect. But until we come up with a different term to describe the new multicultural America, which is guided now by increasingly guided by new immigrants who have a real hostility and hatred for the old America. I mean, USEN, it may be it, but I don't think it's going to catch on. It's just an awkward term. Up until we have a better term, it's still the best term we have. It's Globalist American Empire. And the unfortunate fact is that a lot of our Americans see themselves represented by it, and they see it as one and the same in America, and they're fully down with these values and ideologies that has been increasingly promoted over the last 100 years. And our main task is to change these people's minds and wake them up to the truth. And I think that gay is a more effective tactic or a more effective word to describe the system we live under than any other term. And that's why I use it. So that is the end of the discussion. I'm sure that will excite a lot of heated commentary and a lot of angry responses. Maybe it might reflect some interesting responses, but I know where a lot of people stand on this, and it's not going to be exciting for a lot of the audience that I appeal to. And then even the type of normie conservatives that I appeal to, they're like, why are you even discussing this topic? And so that's even conceived even in the Twitter engagement I got on the post, is that normies are like, what is even the discussion about? And then the audience who gets it is they're on the opposing. I would say they're agreeing to disagree, but they're just disagreeing. I don't think they're agreeing to disagree. So that's what it is. People are allowed to have their own opinions, and that's my opinion, and I think that it's right, and I'm sticking by it. And that is what it is. So we'll go on to other topics. The next topic I was going to make about the awful question, because there's new data that came out about single female voters and even young females, college students, and their views, and how this is not looking like great news for Republicans. And I want to discuss that at length. But I think that's a topic within itself. I'm probably going to do an IQ supplement on this or later this week or save it up for the discussion next week. So we're going to hold off. That was originally going to be most of my topic today, but after nearly 40 minutes of discussing the GAE, I guess we're going to go on to other topics that are going to be a little bit shorter because I also have a cognitive elite question that is going to take up a lot of time. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion you're going to want to hear. It's about the Daily Wire versus Steven Crowder fight, which I think is pretty... I can give a unique perspective on my background in conservative media. But I have one other topic before we get into that, the cognitive elite question. And that is, it's trying to connect all these dots that we're seeing with Antifa and Democratic lawmakers. But in this weekend, Antifa went wild in Atlanta. They rioted in Atlanta. They were burning cop cars, smashing stores. And it was a very much an organized effort. You know, it was local Antifa getting involved in this. And this is stemming from Antifa occupying land outside of Atlanta that the police were trying to use for a police academy. And they have their own little tree houses there. I mean, the literal tree houses that they have is their own little squatter or intentional community out there in the woods. And most of the people who live there are the type of freak shows you would imagine, as looking by their mug shots. It's an interesting group of people, to say the least. And they've been refusing to get off the land, and they had a confrontation with police, and police shot one of their guys who's armed and attacking them, and they then decided to riot in his benefit, and they got arrested. And there were protests in other parts of America, and like in Boston, which the daughter, as Catherine Clark referred to her as, who Catherine Clark is now our minority whip for the Democrats, minority whip for the House Democrats to be specific. Her quote unquote daughter, looking at pictures, you'd wonder, and the real name is Jared Dowell, I think, but now goes by Riley Dowell, which is still a pretty masculine name, but whatever floats their boat, I suppose. The GAE got arrested, and Catherine Clark treated it like her daughter or whatever, her child, had gotten diagnosed with cancer when she spoke about this on Twitter. So there's all these protests everywhere, and that there's still all this connection between Democratic lawmakers. As I made a joke on Twitter, it's like, there were all these children of the powerful Democratic politicians in the 60s who they turned to anti-war protesting. Most famously, Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense. His son became a very active anti-war protester, and it caused a lot of consternation for his father. Now it's these establishment Democrats, and they have Antifa children. Tim Kaine is one example. There's a bunch of others who I'm trying to remember, they escape my mind, but it's about at least 5 or so elected Democratic officials, probably more now with Catherine Clark, who've had their children end up to be these Antifa agitators and get arrested for it. And of course, they don't face any real charges. They face a slap on the wrist, and then these people are turned into heroes afterwards that they're violating it. So there's that aspect that's happening, but it's also the interesting aspect is how to... A point that Mystery Grove and I've made on Twitter a lot is how organized the left is for violence at a moment's notice. I think in some ways that the violence that we saw, you could say, like, downplay it and say, well, it's just a few burnings, and it's still, they're kind of allowed to do this rather than the right, but they're still capable of doing this and initiating this violence. And this is what we saw throughout the summer of 2020 and going even into the fall, especially in places like Portland. And this stuff was still going on in the first weeks and months of Biden's administration. I remember a few weeks after J6, there was these guys, I think it was in Eugene, Oregon, or maybe Olympia, Washington, one of those types of, it wasn't the main two cities in the Pacific Northwest. And they invaded the city hall. They were creating, they stormed the city hall, and they're creating a ruckus there and doing exactly what January 6 guys had done and that they had declared as domestic terrorism. And these guys were able to do what they want. But it's died off. Since then, I think because one, Trump's no longer in office, so these liberal prosecutors are no longer willing to give them the benefit of the doubt instead of saying, well, they're anti-Trump protesters, or they're so mad about J6 that they had to storm the city hall or storm a government building or attack a federal government building. And they no longer give them those excuses. And I think a lot of some of the establishment Democrat rings that were funding these guys are no longer funding them. But they're still capable of doing this. I mean, they still show up armed to the teeth outside of these drag queen story hours to protect them. And you can make fun of them for how they're holding their guns, or, how they're dressed, or how they look goofy. But they're still there with firearms. They can still use those firearms with impunity, as seen in, there was a protest, I think it was in Colorado, where a guy, who was a security guard for a camera crew and had sympathies with Antifa, executed a Trump supporter on camera and got off with it. They claimed it was self-defense. There's been a few other cases of self-defense. Are they able to run checkpoints in cities and operate it on their own, and the police can't do anything about it? And if an ordinary citizen reacts towards their threatening and violence, in a violent manner, such as somebody pointing a gun at them and them shooting at them in response, as we saw, I think this was in Austin, Texas, where a soldier shot an Antifa checkpoint guard who was threatening him. That guy is now on trial for murder charges. And then obviously in the famous case of Kyle Rittenhouse that we've seen, that these Antifa could act with impunity with firearms and violently attack anyone that they decided was a threat. And if that person who was being violently attacked and his life threatened with being beaten by a mob or even shot by the mob, and that person acted to protect themselves, they would be charged with murder. But all this happened under Trump and and them using these violent protests in 2020 as a part of their campaign to unseat Trump from the presidency. But now we're in a different era where people, Trump's no longer in office. Biden is promising normality, the restoration of normality, and that we're respect the law and order again, which obviously they're not, with rising crime rates and the open border or the invasion at the border, which they don't seem to care about. But when it comes to the violent left and these riots, they don't have as much incentive to protect them now as they did before. There is no Black Lives Matter martyr involved in here. They're not rioting because of, some black guy shot by the police. They're rioting because their own guy was shot by the police when they were occupying land that they want to build for a police academy. They don't have the same type of moral justification as they did before, or the cover that they needed to, appeal to liberals to protect them from the law and protect them from consequences. So it is interesting to see if the law will actually throw the book at these guys. Will they actually charge them with serious offenses, or will they let them off the hook? I think the child of Catherine Clark is obviously not going to meet the full consequences. They're not going to charge a congressman's kid with vandalism. They're going to let them off the hook. It's obvious. But for these others in Atlanta, one interesting thing about them is that most of them are out of state, which I do think Antifa maybe the hardcore of them who are wanting to live their lives full time as Antifa is maybe in decline from the Trump era, because I think back then, most of these guys who would ever be arrested at these protests or these brawls with the right-wing figures or right-wing groups, a lot of them were local. But now a lot of these guys have moved from other places to there. Maybe it's just because they have a popular commune there, or maybe even some of the locality of even when they're at their height back in the Trump era. Maybe that was a bit overstated, but it is something to note that none of these guys are local, as they're all people traveling there to join the commune. Interesting thing to note. Maybe that does indicate a change, that it doesn't have as much, as the real committed zealots aren't as hardcore as they were prior to Trump. I'm not quite sure if that's the case, because once again, they're still able to call upon like a dozen people to stand armed guards outside a drag queen story hour. So I don't know if that's the case. And that's still more than the right can muster to protest these events, or the type of Antifa presence they have outside of these drag queen events. It's usually a larger than the right-wing protest against it. So coming to the question of whether they let these guys off or throw the book at them, it does indicate whether the liberal system, when there's really no need for Antifa, when they're really just cause an annoyance for them and create bad optics for Democrats, if they will punish them to send a message to them to say, you're not fucking around anymore, we're in charge, we don't need you, you need to cut this shit out. Or if they're just so sympathetic and don't care about their actions, and there is more establishment sympathy for the radical left than we would think, and they let them off the hook, that can be seen whether they pursue these charges to the full extent or not. So that'll be an interesting dynamic. We'll keep an eye on that. But one takeaway you do need to take is that, or one takeaway that is important to learn from this is how the left is still very organized. It's still very violent. It can still do these things at a moment's notice. And there's nothing comparable on the right. Partially because if the system, if right-wingers started doing that, those guys would be facing a lifetime in jail. The police would have probably shot them, as we could see with January 6th, even when they're walking around the Capitol, people wanted them to be shot within the lines, no less. And the right can't even do that. I mean, the right, even if you look back at the Patriot Front event from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho last year, where they were about to protest some LGBT event. I forget what it was. And they weren't, there was no violence planned from them, but they, pulled them all off their U-Haul and arrested them all and, made an example of them. And I don't think they were planning to riot of any sort, but they just arrested them for their mere presence, that they were engaged in something wrong, which they still have not done with Antifa. But maybe they'll start doing this if they start acting up and violent. I'm skeptical of this, but I think, some of these lawmakers really just don't have a need for them anymore. And they're white, mostly white. And they really just think that these guys are fucking up what they're trying to do politically. And it's an easy win for them to just say, look at us. We even punish our own side. And these Trumpers won't do anything. They'll stand with the J6ers while we throw these guys in jail. Not that they need to do this, but it's such an easy win for them. And it's such a political point that they can score by doing that. But I am skeptical they have the will to do that. So we'll keep an eye on that to see what happens. And they even did this in Portland, where all these guys were attacking a federal courthouse building and throwing Molotov cocktails. Majority of them had their charges completely dropped and let free, despite their doing far worse things than any of these J6ers. Next topic before we get to the Con Relief question. It's going to be pretty brief on this but it's something I probably should have mentioned last week. I think this broke on Monday when it was happening, as the Sheila Jackson Lee bill to institute hate speech laws, which Sheila Jackson Lee, she does not have a 187 IQ. We'll put it that way. Introduced this bill to say that anyone who posts material or is found with material that leads to white supremacist hate crime or anything of that will now be a penalty. Now, what does that mean? It's very vague and ambiguous, and a lot of conservative lawmakers and conservative figures made the obvious point that this clearly demonizes free speech, or this criminalizes free speech. And the bill would say that any criticism of non-whites that you may make will lead to violence, and thus that becomes a hate crime, and thus you must be prosecuted for it. And that's the new hate speech law. It's a hate speech law that totally abrogates freedom of speech, which Sheila Jackson Lee, in her maybe 87 IQ that she has, insisted that no, it protects free speech. And there was just a lot of misinformation about this. That there's just, they weren't just smart enough to realize this. And she's like, it protects freedom of speech. But then they're like, posting online materials that could lead to a hate crime, that could mean it. But what does that mean? Is that posting 1350 statistics? Is that, posting magic outbreaks in aisle 6? What does that constitute? Is that it gives them wide leeway to prosecute anything they want, especially the type of free speech that we express on the internet. So it's obviously a hate speech law, but nobody wants to do it. I think the rewarding factor about this is that I don't think anyone's going to sign on for this. And one benefit we really do have is the lack of hate speech laws in America. I really can't overstate how integral this is, or how good this is for us here in America. And some people criticize that we have too much freedom of speech from a right-wing perspective. I knew some Brits who would sometimes claim that things are better in Europe because they have hate speech laws, and that allows them to rein in the crazies. That if people go too far off, that, well, people will know not to go, or rather, people will know not to go too far off because then they'll know they'll get arrested. But I don't really believe that. And even in the UK, you can be arrested for criticizing Muslims on Facebook, or worst of all, criticizing non-white soccer players and all this ridiculous stuff. And it really limits what can happen politically in these countries, or even, politician statements about immigrants or of any type of matter. They'll try to open a hate speech law investigation to them. And this is the same throughout Europe. This really hinders European ability to operate politically and for people to express these ideas. And one thing I do have this take that could be stands corrected, but I do think that ordinary Britons, or British, whatever you want to call them, or at least the English, are probably a little bit more aware of our issues, are more willing to act on them. I think when you compare the immigration fight, which I'm writing an article about this and American attitudes towards it, is that the British were more upset by 45,000 illegal immigrants coming to their country than Americans were by 3 million coming last year. Big difference between the two. But they were much more incensed by the 45,000. They were also much more incensed by a lot of these migrants who are coming here, being placed in rural villages and towns that are, have a long-standing population. Maybe they only have 200 people, and now they get 100 new newcomers. That's what they have to deal with. And this is found even throughout much of Europe. And even when it comes to the transgender issue, the British government is now in a fight with the Scottish over when someone can legally change their gender. Is that the UK law insists that they have to go through this whole, some people may say that this is still cucked, but it's better than America's, that they have to go through this whole process and they have to be at least 18 years old to legally change their gender. While Scotland was trying to reduce the age and the standards for saying that you want to change your gender. In America, there's like people under 10 who are getting gender reassignment surgery. And, in UK, they're actively talking about restricting that type of surgery to kids under 18. So but as it happens, speaking frankly about these issues can still get you arrested and charged with a hate crime, which in America it can't. And I think that does give us a lot of freedom. And one thing is, I think Britain, even if the British are more aware of these issues when it comes to immigration, maybe even their awareness of crime, even though they have less crime than us, and even the transgender stuff, they have worse political representation and they're less free to express these sentiments in public due to the restrictive laws that they have and the crooked political system they have that allows these very cucky Tories to be their only choice for voting. While despite all the problems with the Republicans are better than the Tories on a lot of these issues, and Republicans are able to exert less control over individual members than the Tories are. Like the speaker battle, that type of thing, they would not. The Tories can easily punish backbenchers much more easily because those parties are much more unified and controlling of their members than the Republican Party is. So I think when you look into the European situation, in some countries you feel that they're on the more of the right track than us, such as France, I would say. But then you could look at a country like the UK, where it seems that a lot of the ordinary people maybe are a little bit more aware of our issues than they are in America. But due to the fact of these free speech laws, they can't really do anything about it. And they can only privately say it in their home with no one listening. They can still be arrested if someone overhears it. And that does create a chilling effect on free speech. And in Germany, it's even worse. But I think even Germans are in a worse state than us when it comes to some of these issues, unlike the British. But even there, saying some of this stuff can get you arrested, and they'll do a whole raid on you and all this stuff. So we have that benefit here that we're able to advocate for our issues without the threat of the SWAT team busting down our doors. Now, sometimes it still happens. If you look at the Ricky Vaughn case, where he's being charged with federal crimes over memes, they still want to do that. And that's why they really want laws like Sheila Jackson Lee's in place so they can arrest more people. But thankfully, that has not happened yet. And the federal courts have been pretty strong on the issue of the First Amendment, and it's a huge benefit for us. And no matter how bad America gets, at least we still have the freedom, more freedom of speech than Europe. So, it is a blessing that we have this. There's other things that we need to improve on, but with freedom of speech, we can work to change those things and make them better. Now on to the Codvalite question. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Codvalite option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's at highlyrespected.substack.com. And of course, we publish at least one column now on new schedule. We publish at least one column to Highly Respected Substack every week. So make sure to sign up for those, and make sure to also sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there if you haven't already. And this question comes from Dave, and Dave was asking for my opinion on the Crowder versus Daily Wire fight, which on Twitter I had said that I was pro Crowder. So I feel it's worth expanding upon and talking about the true nature of conservative media. Now, when I would say this, is like Steven Crowder in this fight is not the most sympathetic character. Looking at it from the big picture or looking at it from above without the outside perspective, is that Daily Wire offered him and his production team $50 million over 4 years. All of that $50 million was not going directly to Steven Crowder. A lot of it was going for production costs, his staffing, all those type of costs and expenditures. I don't know if he would have been receiving at least half of it, but probably at most half of it, which is still a ton of money. A lot of Fox stars would, I don't even think, are paid that much money. And it really shows the popularity of these independent I don't know if independent podcast is the right word, but these internet podcasts where their hosts are making as much money as Fox News hosts, are making as much money as pro athletes, which is a wild thought. I think one reason that people came to the side of Daily Wire is when they saw how much Steven Crowder was offered, and they'll be like, shoot, I'd work for even just a tenth of that if I was given that. And this boy doesn't know what he's missing. And so a lot of people were making this, what made Daily Wire the sympathetic, or sympathize more with Daily Wire just for that fact alone. But the dispute over this matter comes from Crowder getting upset that Daily Wire was going to dock his pay if he was demonetized or censored by big tech in his videos. And this is a problem for Crowder because Crowder has faced demonetization and ban threats throughout the existence of his program. And there was even a time that it looked like YouTube was going to completely ban his program, but due to the widespread support of Crowder from mainstream conservative figures and politicians, that it became a real battle and YouTube backed away from it, even though there was strong pressure to ban the platform entirely. But he still gets demonetized a lot, and he still gets some of his videos, throttled and other things that have happened to it. And so this is a very real problem with Crowder. And what Daily Wire's demand is, I think if you're approaching this as a businessman, which one thing is that you have to note is that, everyone has always talked about how the right is made up of working class people or downtrodden and stuff. The Crowder versus Daily Wire fight makes it clear that a lot of the right are small business owners, or business owner aspirants, or managers, and how they defended Daily Wire, because they're saying, well, if I'm running a business and this guy is not making what he's supposed to, then I'm going to dock his pay. And they're approaching this from saying that they're managing a sales team, and if a guy on the sales team is not making as many sales as he should, then his pay is going to be docked. He's not going to make as much as another salesman who is making more sales than he is. So that's how they're approaching this issue. And that issue of conservatives approaching this as seeing it if it was their own business, that makes them likely to sympathize with Daily Wire. But what they don't realize is that this opinion makes them willing to support big tech censorship. Is that, well, if you say offensive things that Google and Facebook and others don't like, then and they censor you, then it's on you to stop saying those things because it's costing me money. So it becomes a very transactional relationship where it's just about where it all comes down to business decisions rather than speaking truth to power, or speaking what you feel is right and what you feel is accurately describing the situation around us. Instead, you have to follow the guidelines of what big tech says so you don't have your pay docked. And if you have your pay, That's the main goal of Daily Wire. So it is a tricky situation. I mean, understand it from a business sense, but it also at the same time gives big tech to set the guidelines for your platform. And if Daily Wire is running on this, this standard, it indicates of how cozy a relationship they have with big tech, which was another Crowder dispute. I think in one, to say, some things negative about Crowder, I think Crowder was a little histrionic about it. I think Crowder didn't help his side by saying that they're slave wages. And I think Jeremy Boring, in his phone call that he recorded, like jokingly referred to as slave wages and all that. I think it made, also some of that behavior made people not want to be on Crowder's side. But at the point of it, the main dispute is over Crowder being irate that they would try to cut his pay if he doesn't follow big tech's guidelines. And it indicates that the standard for Daily Wire sets is that you must follow big tech's guidelines, otherwise we will punish you. Now, you can argue that from a business perspective, and that makes sense from a business perspective, but from a political perspective, that is not the wise position to take. So from a political perspective, which I'm not involved in Daily Wire's business, and I don't give a shit about Daily Wire's business. Actually, I do think that there's something wrong. There's something very negative about Daily Wire becoming this prominent power, the dominant power in conservatism media and conservative ink. And I think that Steven Crowder, who, took a lot of risks to go against it, maybe it wasn't the wisest decision and maybe he's not going about it the best way, but I think I will stand with him because I view Crowder as less worse than Daily Wire. And I think Crowder still engages in interesting topics about race. He's willing to, he's had a whole episode in 2022. I think it was 2022. It may have been 2021 where he ripped into Martin Luther King. Nobody on Daily Wire is ever going to do that. Maybe except for Candace Owens, oddly enough. But Candace Owens, they definitely hold back. I think Candace Owens and Matt Walsh occasionally say interesting things. And I think Candace Owens wants to go beyond the perimeters that Daily Wire sets for her. And there's definitely a lot of conflict between Daily Wire's management and Candace Owens over a variety of issues, whether it comes to Russia. They were clearly not a fan of her being very anti-Ukraine, and especially of her relationship with Kanye. Their support for Kanye, that they were definitely not fans of that at all. So she is willing to take more independence. But with Walsh, even when he says interesting things about anti-white racism the transgender stuff, like all conservatism is about that. So that's not as risky of a position. I mean, it's a right position, but I just don't think it's... I think he does good work with that, but I don't think that that's, going to ruffle any feathers at Daily Wire. When he does do these occasional things, he makes sure that he stays still safely on the plantation. Like, he's always been anti-Trump, even back in the 2016 primary. Never a Trump supporter, always a DeSantis fan. Being a Trump supporter at Daily Wire is just going to be frowned upon. He was also in the Ahmaud Arbery case. He was a huge defender of Ahmaud Arbery, just saying he was doing guy things by, stooping around a property late at night, just guy things. And he's had some other bad takes too. He's had some good takes as well. You got to take, and he's also condemned a lot of other people, right-wing people like Nick Fuentes and others, where he's just like made it his mission in life to just attack these people and attack them with more vigor than he would ever have for the left. And that is something that he is. He makes sure to stay safely in the confines. Well, Candace Owens has a little bit more independence. But most of the other people, the main person is still Ben Shapiro. And a Ben Shapiro-dominated right is a terrible prospect. It's very fortunate we have Tucker Carlson as one of the most popular figures. But if it could at some day, maybe like Tucker show get canceled. And it probably wouldn't be a Fox News host dictating the ideas of, in the way that Tucker does. If Tucker disappeared from the Fox primetime limelight, it would probably be replaced by someone like Ben Shapiro. And Ben Shapiro has millions of listeners, and a lot of people listen to his opinions. And Ben Shapiro, even in the past, he supported restricting legal immigration. He's dropped that. He's now back to supporting legal immigration. And he's a huge neocon. And he's also wants to condemn anyone who goes too far into race and identity issues. He is not a good influence on the right. And ultimately, Daily Wire is controlled by him and Jeremy Boring. And those are people you do not want in control of conservative Inc. And so no matter even the Crowder dispute is like, Crowder says more interesting things than anyone else on Daily Wire, except for with the exception of maybe Candace Owens. And Candace Owens is definitely restricted in what she can say. And Crowder, by signing that deal with Daily Wire, would be more restricted in what he could say, less independent thought, less venturing into dangerous territory, because he knew it would come at the cost. They would dock his pay and try to punish him if he did that. So for that reason alone, I stand with Steven Crowder. I was almost going to call him Steven Shapiro. That would be an unholy combination. But we have Steven Crowder as the side I take, because I view that Daily Wire it is, besides Fox, the second most powerful force in conservatism. And in some ways, I think it shapes more because it has a more devoted audience. Like, I mean, Fox has a lot of casual viewers who are just like old people who just like turn on the TV and they watch along. Like, podcast listeners are like a more devoted audience where they base more of their opinions on what they hear on that podcast rather than what they see in a TV segment. It's much more it's a much more dedicated way of consuming media than it is to watching a show. And Daily Wire really is part, by being this huge force, they are helping to try to push the right back to its pre-Trump era, where it's just stuck in 2014, where we're just talking about taxes and limited government, and we're back to supporting Israel one of our main causes, and we're supportive of a neoconservative foreign policy. That's what the right is about, and that's what the Daily Wire wants. And despite it's all snazzy, new logos and stuff, and they are doing interesting stuff, I think the idea of doing movies and entertainment and all that is like something that conservatives should do. The problem is it's being done by Daily Wire, and it has their agenda at heart, which is not America first. It's not Trumpian. It's not nationalist. It's conservative Inc., and it is bad for them to gain a stranglehold on what the right thinks. So I'm glad Steven Crowder didn't sign with them, but I think it's going to be a little bit harder for his career afterwards to do this. But he took a risk against the media empire. And yes, even though maybe he was a whiny brat about the $50 million, he still walked away from $50 million because he didn't want to have his speech restricted over by the Daily Wire. And I think that does deserve some degree of respect. Maybe he didn't handle it the best way. Maybe he didn't seem the most likable person in this situation, but I think he was in the right from a political perspective, and in that perspective that we don't want Daily Wire dominating the right, and we don't want conservative media in bed with big tech, which is a really under-noticed fact. And this is when I can bring up my experience in conservative Inc. For most of the time that I worked in conservative Inc., they would have gotten on both, especially the Daily Caller, they would have gotten on their knees and done whatever Facebook or Google had asked them, because they're so dependent on the traffic generated by those platforms. Now, it makes sense from a business perspective, but it also comes, it does create some skepticism towards their motives when they're covering these topics. And for Google, with the Daily Caller, they're obsessed with getting the right SEO, with doing everything right so Google would promote the results, and same with Facebook. And I remember they gave tens of thousands of dollars, probably hundreds of thousands of dollars in advertising on Facebook to build up an audience for there. And they would be in close communication with Facebook, asking like, we'll make sure that this doesn't violate the codes. And some of it was more just like algorithm, trying to figure out the right algorithm and stuff, and like the right way to prep posts. I didn't experience that much censorship at the time, but they were also very hesitant about any articles criticizing Facebook because they had the traffic was so Facebook dependent. And I think that's still the case with Daily Wire. I think Daily Caller got fucked much more so than probably not much more so. Even if you Google search articles, you never get hits, even from the Daily Wire. You never get hits from Daily Caller. You have to type in like the story and then type in Daily Caller to find it. And it's the same with Breitbart. Washington Examiner will sometimes come up. Fox News actually comes up. Which is now why a lot of these other online media outlets are dying out that were prominent back in the Obama era and the early Trump era are now dying off, because now Fox News is just cut into their territory by expanding their online media operation of having, blurbs and these short stories that people can share on social media. And, in the past, Fox News didn't have that much of an operation. They were still relying on conservative media to deliver these reports. And now Fox News does its own reports cutting out the middleman, cutting out the, these, I don't know if cutting out the middleman would be the right phrase, but cutting out these smaller outlets that were providing these news and blurbs for Fox News. They now just do it on their own. And unlike for these other conservative sites, and this even includes Daily Wire, Google does not punish them in the search results. But Daily Wire is still heavily dependent on Facebook. And liberals have been complaining about this for 4 years, or maybe even 5 years, about how the top posts on Facebook are all this conservative content from Daily Wire. It's like Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro. It's all this content, and they're like, they are allowing all this conservative misinformation to come out. And really, the fact that you can see that Daily Wire content does so well on Facebook indicates that they're not going to willing to upset Facebook, because that's who butters their bread. I mean, it makes sense from a business perspective, but as I said, from a political perspective, it creates, it should generate a bit of skepticism. And that was the same with all these other conservative media outlets. And it was especially true with Facebook, because Facebook is where, even when Google began screwing over these companies with SEO and search algorithms, they were still working with Facebook, and Facebook was still giving them benefits. I don't know if it's still the case with Daily Caller at the time, because they were doing a lot of videos. They were one funny thing with Daily Caller is that they're so heavily dependent on social media, is that when there was a pivot to video, a lot of the pivot to video for no matter the media was because they would get ad revenue through Facebook. Now, not everyone got the ad revenue. You had to sign up for the program and be approved and go through all these hoops and hoops to get to that ad revenue. But people saw this as a huge money-making opportunity. And so that's why there was this huge pivot to video, which didn't turn out so well over time, just because of how Facebook changed its algorithm and how Facebook was forced to stop prioritizing news and by Congress and government officials who were tired of misinformation. And so all these companies that pivoted video then wasted a lot of money. Daily Caller was probably one of them, where they built this massive studio. They probably didn't waste any money because they didn't hire any talent to do videos, at least when I was there. They still tried to hire talent, but they tried to hire them at the bare minimum. But they built like this whole studio, hired this whole massive video camera team. And it took them years to get signed up for that ad revenue program with Facebook. Like, I think they started trying in like 2017, and I don't even think they got approved till well after I was gone, maybe 2019, 2020. I don't even know if they're still on the program, but they finally did that, and it was like all this amount of investment going in there just to, please Facebook. And they had to once again do all these things for Facebook's favor, to be signed up for it and do all these things, because this is how they get traffic. And it's very hard for a conservative media operation to survive if it's hated by social media or these platforms. I mean, Breitbart is the one where it's like it's managed to survive even with all the companies coming down hard on it. I think even, Facebook came down hard on them in 2017 when, all these other companies were spending tens of thousands of dollars trying to build up their fan base on Facebook. Breitbart was being punished by them, and they were getting ad revenue canceled by Sleeping Giants and others. So this created the opportunity this creates the paradigm that we have with conservative media. So yes, they are very much heavily dependent on big tech, but so we all are to an extent. Like, we all depend on having access to these platforms of Twitter, to YouTube, to spread our message, because it's very hard if we're just relegated to Gab and Telegram to spread this message. Far fewer people are on these platforms than elsewhere. And even with Gab, they want, Gab wants people to get off Gab that they don't like. Like, Gab attacked me over my tweets. It's very weird when you have on their Telegram, not on Gab, but they attacked me over my tweets. And it's like, I don't think this is the best way to attract me to Gab, but I guess they just don't want me on Gab anymore. So I guess their message is get off Gab. That's what I guess. It's just funny. But even with these platforms that you're restricted to, BitChute or what have you, it's like you do have a limited fan base to get audience to reach. And so we're all dependent on these platforms to remain to exist and to allow a space. But even when it comes to conservatives, like, Facebook is not going to kick off Daily Wire. But they may limit how much money they make through Facebook if they go a little bit off the plantation. And it's the same that happens with YouTube. And I think Daily Wire probably has to have one of the better relationships with Google than probably any other conservative media company, which the relationships with Google for a lot of conservative media has been pretty bad for a much longer time, while Facebook, it's been a little bit more complicated and muddled. It's still been better than in Google. But that's just what happens if these companies are trying to build successful enterprises. But at the same time, they do need to allow free speech to happen. And if they're going to get a massive, talent with a lot of followers, and they're going to tell him that you have to stick with the Daily Wire party line, which is determined by big tech, otherwise we're going to cut your pay. That is not the standard conservatives need to make. But it also reveals, the Crowder Daily Wire fight reveals how a lot of conservatism is just a business. And a lot of it is not centered around political change, but it's centered around entertainment. And I think this is a bigger problem for conservatism than it is for the left. The left, partially because the left gets financing from these wealthy billionaires that they don't have to worry about, having these sites with horrible advertisements that shut down your computer, or that they're so dependent on big tech that they'll make their personalities stick to the big tech line so they don't get cut off. Not like the left ever has to worry about that, but just making that point that they're not as dependent on that. They're able to talk and write about whatever they want. Generally, that doesn't offend the censorship as well, but it does create different initiatives. I don't think mainstream liberals, like something like Vox, is not done as for the type of pure commercial profit that something like the Daily Wire is done for. They really do make that website to influence politics, to influence lawmakers, to influence people who are actually willing to make change, and that's their goal. And that's the same even with these smaller far left publications like Jacobin, or even the guys who make even a lot of money from this, and maybe the entertainment world like Vaush and others. They still are, their focus is still on impacting and changing the political nature of America. And that's very much true for the journalists who enter into, mainstream liberalism. They're there to make a change. It is not there to build a successful grifting enterprise, to, sell gold bonds or whatever to old people. They are there to change America and change the world. And that's part of the reasons why they're a little bit more successful than right in enacting that change. But for the right, it's a little bit too much business oriented. Maybe it's because of the fact that conservatives in America are very business oriented. Even the politics of the Republican Party is centered around business, while it's not centered around business for liberals. Is that it's centered around cultural matters. And even when they approach economics, it's from a moralistic and a cultural perspective rather than simple economics, while for the right, it's all economics. And so a lot of these guys get in there, and it's the problem with grifting. There are grifters on the left. Look at resistance libtards, and they have terrible aesthetics, and they're very stupid. But when it comes to the predominant forces of liberalism compared to the right, there is not this type of salesmanship and this used car dealer mentality that is predominant on, like, with Vox or New York Times or any of these other lefty publications or think tanks. While even with the Daily Wire, which is, I would argue, is the second most popular force, has a very much of this used car dealer mindset that is unfortunately really prevalent on the right, despite all these claims that we're just working class, and we're not in management, we're not running our own business. But the popularity of this attitude is found in Daily Wire supporters and even the Daily Wire itself. I think a clear example of this is one time Ben Shapiro was speaking at the March for Life. I think this was like in 2019 or so. And he was recording a podcast there. And he's giving a talk to the whole audience. And then he's like, well, hello, I've got to take a commercial break to advocate for toothpaste. And he's like, this toothpaste is incredible. You got to love it. And then it's like the whole crowd is like listening to him do a fucking commercial for a toothpaste brand or what. I don't know if it's a toothpaste brand, for some toothpaste brand. And they're like, what the hell is this? That would never happen with the left. The left would never do, like, they're giving a speech before a large audience and like, hold on, I have to do this advertisement. while the right would do it, and they would defend it for business and economic reasons. So there's just a different approach to it, and it does create kind of a shady vibe to it rather than to the left. I don't want to go too far as Richard Hanania, who is, had this really stupid article about how the mainstream media never lies. And then at the point is like, except for race and gender issues. I'm like, well, that's like the core focus of the media right now. And they lie about that all the time. So I don't want to go into that far as like, well, they're respectable institutions, but they at least create the veneer of respectability. Some of it is due to the limitations the right faces from greater threat of censorship, the fact that a lot of advertisers will worry about, getting harassed if they advertise on these platforms, and other things that are not just natural limitations that, mainstream media publications don't want to have. But even the ones that, have less fear of that, there's a huckster attitude towards how they approach these things. And even when they do political issues, it's about finding the topic that has the most engagement and most entertaining rather than giving the truth on the matter. And that's how they approach things. And it's very much too much like a businessman economic approach, because politics, you do need some appreciation of business skills and like what works and what doesn't. And you can't just do things that, obviously irritate your audience all the time, even though maybe I don't follow that, because I feel like every week there's like my audience is wanting to kill me over something. This week an example, but I think it's like when you have to approach politics, you have to approach it from the level of seeking truth and wanting to change the world rather than wanting to just simply make a lot of money and approaching it like a businessman would with like selling cars or something on the business. You have to do it from a very different perspective. And I think Daily Wire really typifies the business first direction of the Republican Party and conservatism. And it's something that, they've built a very successful business, and they are, as I keep saying, the second most powerful force in conservatism after Fox. Excluding the GOP, but, outside of the GOP force in that. But that's not a good thing, and there's numerous problems with that, and I think most of the audience would agree. So those are my thoughts on the Crowder versus Daily Wire fight. I stick with Crowder, or stand with Crowder with that, even though I understand why some people may side with Daily Wire, but I think in this battle, you have to take Crowder for the reasons I've stated before. So that is it for this highly controversial respected episode. And we will be back with another IQ supplement later this week. It should be great. Maybe I'll do it on the awful dilemma on these pollings that's come out on the young white women or young women in general and their political preferences. I may do something on that, or we may have another topic. I'll keep you posted, but we'll of course have another great, highly respected next week. So until next time, stay respected.